Welcome. Welcome to this evening together. Let the little children come to me, our ecological future and biblical past. We're so thankful that you're here, both in person and virtually. Welcome. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is a traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And we're thankful for their welcome to us so that we can learn, live, and pray on their land. It's our goal that the Center for Christian Engagement become a source for healing and reconciliation with respect to the First Nations and Indigenous peoples in British Columbia and in Canada, and to accompany those beyond those communities as well who need care by acting humbly and wisely as we move forward together. So the Center for Christian Engagement is a center at St. Mark's College that emphasizes the importance of listening, reflecting, learning, discussing, and praying as we discuss and explore the Christian and Catholic intellectual tradition and seek to learn from others and from their traditions. We're thankful to the Cullen family, Mark and Barbara, who are with us here today. Thank you for coming, for their generous support of the lectures that we give here. And it is truly generous, and we're thankful. I want to thank the donors to our center as well. It's important to recognize Peter Bull and Angus Reid and Andy Zox and their willingness to support our work here, their commitment to the life of the academic world and the work of the church in the world. Tonight, we are thankful too that we have Greg Kennedy with us and that he's going to talk to us about our ecological future. And through our discussions, and I can tell you this is true, I think Greg will agree, we started discussing some things together, and he said, you know, why don't you join in with me and we'll do this talk together. So we have two speakers tonight, Dr. Greg Kennedy and then myself. And Dr. Kennedy will speak first, and he'll consider how climate change and other ecological crises are not future threats, but current reality. A growing number of people, particularly children, now experience eco-anxiety. He's going to talk about how we respond to the challenges afflicting the earth as a matter of intergenerational justice for today's children and for the next generation of young ones. In the second part of the talk, I'll consider what we can learn from Jesus' teaching on children with respect to ecological concerns of children today. What does Jesus have to tell us about the 21st century when he was speaking to children in the first century? So I want to introduce Greg a little bit more. Greg Kennedy practices the joyful disciplines of poetry, spiritual direction, retreat leadership, and farming at the Ignatius Jesuit Center in Guelph, Ontario. He's a PhD in philosophy, a master's in theology, that allow him, as he says, to question lovingly both heaven and earth. Inspired by the spirit that moves through all faiths, he finds his belief instructed by a diversity of lived wisdoms. He's the author of several books, and this is where people in person have an advantage over those of you in your homes. We have some of these books here, if you're interested in buying them later. An Ontology of Trash from 2006, Reupholstered Psalms, volumes 1 to 3, and Amazing Friendships Between Animals and Saints. I really like this book, and I really highly encourage you to take a look at it. So after both of us speak, I'll open up the question to audience members. And for those who are here in person, we have a microphone set up in the middle aisle. For those who are watching from home, please type your questions into the Q&A portion. We will monitor those questions and we'll try to get to all of them. We might not be able to. If we don't, send me an email, jmartens@stmarkscollege.ca. And now let's welcome Dr. Greg Kennedy.
Thank you, John. Thank you one and all for being here. So good to gather. I've come to bring you life and life to the full. This is what Jesus promised us. And so what is life to the full? We might ask ourselves, what is a full life? What does that entail? Because when Jesus also says, let the children come to me, when the disciples were trying to dissuade the children from doing so, kind of keep them back. Jesus was saying, these children need full life, and you are preventing them from full life. And so he got quite angry. Jesus gets angry now and then. He got quite angry and reprimanded his disciples for preventing the children from this fullness of life. So we're going to look a little bit about that. What is fullness of life? And how might we, like these well-intentioned disciples, be preventing the little ones from fullness of life? And so this, as John mentioned, is a question, and Pope Francis has talked about this as well, intergenerational justice, because we are incurring a debt from our children and from our grandchildren and great-grandchildren and such that is getting bigger and bigger, and we probably can't pay it off. So I'd like to start off with a little let the children come to me. A little, whoops. There we go. We're just going to play a tiny little video, and then I'll explain it afterwards.
So adorable. So adorable. He likes to lick the apple.
Do we have a sound on it?
We've got to help this little guy.
You're hearing a sound? Okay, we don't hear a sound. Anyway, a friend of mine found this little field mouse caught by a local, this is in Guelph, caught by a local cat, maybe her very own cat. And the field mouse was injured, had a broken leg.
Oh.
And so she took it and
Some privacy. He likes the leaf on him. Every time I go, I put a little leaf on him.
the poor mouse, a very cute little mouse. So what did she do after she put it in this little box?
Oh.
She oops. She phoned the local Guelph Humane Society, and they came and picked up this little mouse and brought it to the Humane Society and took care of it. Now, a tiny little cute little mouse, which is lovely when you think about the amount of effort and care that goes into this little mouse and other animals. You think how lovely that is. This friend of mine has almost a childlike wonder, a childlike appreciation for the small. And so she was able to protect the small, and this agency was able to help her do it. Now, this stands in stark contrast, you could say, with other places in the world and in Canada. For example, the tar sands project or the oil sands project in northern Alberta. So think of all the care and love that went to save this little mouse. And we look at the tar sands project, the oil sands project, where in 2008, many years ago, I couldn't find a more recent, thorough study done. They said that the study is called Tar Sands Mining Causes Bird Habitat Loss. The projected strip mining of 740,000 acres of forest and wetlands in the tar sands will result in the loss of breeding habitat for between 500,000 and 3.6 million adult birds. The corresponding impact on breeding will mean a loss of 4.8 million to 36 million young birds over a 20-year period, and 9.6 million to 72 million birds over a 40-year period. Annual bird mortality from landing and drowning in oily water ranges from 8,000 birds to over 100,000. And they project that that's going to triple. So all of a sudden, all this love that goes into a little mouse, and yet we do things like this where millions upon millions upon millions of birds, individual birds, and even species are being lost. The World Wildlife Fund a few years ago put out a study that basically said during my lifetime, I was born in 1975, during my lifetime, around the world, basically animal populations have gone down 60%. So the world is 60%, has less 60% fewer animals in my lifetime. Children love animals. A full life for me would include animals. I can't imagine a life, we all were young children who didn't love birds and dinosaurs, of course, dinosaurs, but they're not around here anymore. But imagine a life without animals. 819 million animals in Canada are killed for our consumption each year. We eat close to 1 billion farm animals. So a deep humane concern for a little field mouse and for selected animals, our pets, for example, is beautiful. Can we extend that concern, that love, to other species, to other individuals? And what does it say about us that we put so much effort into one and no effort at all into the others? I would say that this failure to see perhaps the totality of our actions is a failure of our imagination, our failure to see the invisible. I mean, I don't really know what's going on in the boreal forest because I'm not there. So it fails to impact me. If perhaps I saw all these species and individuals being torn from their homes, as it were, perhaps I would act. So there are important, I would say there are important ecological virtues that children can teach us. And children have this deep, deep concern for individuals. So again, this friend of mine who took such care of this field mouse, she has this childlike wonder for the small. Just another kind of example of how we treat animals. This is a chicken barn. They're probably for meat. The chickens that give us eggs are usually kept in tiny little cages. They can't move. So I want to present to you 3 ecological virtues that children can teach us. And the first is wonder. We all know we were all children once, and part of the pain of growing older is that our sense of wonder atrophies. And we just get kind of used to what is. And we kind of think that it's, perhaps it's a muscle, I'm not quite sure what it is, but we gradually can lose our wonder. And this is what part of, I think, what Jesus says, unless you become like a little child and see the world full of wonder, see the world full of God, you're not really going to live fully. It's going to be very hard for you to live fully if you don't get a sense of wonder and awe. Now, part of wonder, of course, is being outside. What kid doesn't like to go outside and play in the mud and play in the swinging from a tree? I mean, my childhood was spent mostly outside. But more and more children don't have that opportunity, or deprived of that original sense, that original source of wonder, which is the out of doors. Richard Louv has come up with a term called nature deficit disorder. And he shows that actually it's slightly tongue-in-cheek, but he would say that there's actually, he didn't do kind of scientific studies, but enough anecdotal evidence that says that we are much better. Well, certainly stress and anxiety go down when you go into the woods. I mean, that's been proven. Forest bathing in Japan. And we simply have grown up, in the whole evolutionary history, we've grown up with other species. And when we just stick with our own, we are in a sense bereft, in a sense kind of isolated, because we belong with other species. So there really is a lessening of our life, or perhaps the depth of our life, if we don't have this connection with nature. Now, part of that goes into imagination. I'd like to thank my friend Lorraine Roy. She's a textile artist, and so all these pieces are from her. Imagination allows us to see the invisible, to experience what's not there. And of course, children are masters of imagination. It gives us the freedom of the possibility. When we are caught in necessity and what's right in front of us, we are in a sense enslaved to what is, and the possibility of what is not is, you could say, robbed from us. So without that imagination, we have a very hard time seeing possibility. And finally, I would say another very, very important ecological virtue is non-discrimination. So children, classically, they don't care who they play with. It gets to a point, maybe if it's a girl or a boy, but early on, it doesn't really matter. Black or white doesn't really matter. Even species, it doesn't really matter. And so kids have their stuffed animals or their imaginary friends who could be all kinds of giraffes or who knows what. So as we get older, our sense of discrimination kind of gets bigger, which is helpful sometimes because we need to discriminate. But it can also, of course, lead to prejudice and ossified thought that we get trapped in our own thinking. So if we don't have wonder, if we don't have imagination, and if we don't have the sense that kind of we're all one, it's going to be very, very difficult for us to pay off this ecological debt, this intergenerational debt, I would say. So this is what we can learn from children. And I think when Jesus says, you need to change and become like little children, this is from Matthew. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus. They asked him, who is the most important person in the kingdom of heaven? Jesus called a little child over to him. He had the child stand among them. He said, what I'm about to tell you is true. You need to change and become like little children. You need to change and become like little children. If you don't, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So what is the kingdom of heaven? It's a fully alive place where there's wonder, where the possibility is, where freedom and possibility are abundant, and where everyone is equal. And that everyone extends beyond human beings. Anyone who takes the humble position of this child is the most important in the kingdom of heaven. Anyone who welcomes a little child like this one, like this one, in my name welcomes me. So change and become like little children. We were all little children, so it's not like it's impossible to be like little children. So how do we retrieve what we were? But of course, we just can't go back, and there's no going back, as they say. So you need to change and be unlike little children as well, because little children can be, as we all know, can be very difficult. When I look and the whole maturation process is going from a very self-centered universe that everything revolves around me to realizing, oh boy, there are more people, there are more things in this world than myself, and other people have needs that are beyond mine. So very kind of possessive and self-centered children, who hasn't seen the sandbox scuffles about toys this need to expand beyond ourselves. The cruel and destructive, we all have read Lord of the Flies, perhaps. And why does that resonate so well? Because there's some truth to that. In my particular case, it was Lord of the Ants. I used to get a bucket, fill it halfway with water, and find ants and put it in it, and then put a few leaves in there, and the ants would just tear each other to pieces. It was like a frenzy as they tried to escape, and I loved it, right? This is the best thing ever. I also remember with my friend, during lunch hour, we'd find praying mantises in the schoolyard and feed them grasshoppers. And the praying mantis would just latch onto it like this and basically eat it like a corn cob alive, right? And we'd have a magnifying glass and watch it eat its eyeballs out. And it was so wonderful, right? This is great. So children can be very cruel, very, very cruel. And despite their capacity for imagining things and their vivid imaginations, children have difficulty foreseeing the consequences of actions. They just lack experience. If you do this, something bad's going to happen. If you jump off that shed, you could well break your leg. And you do it once and you say, oh, I won't do that again. Or maybe I will. So experience allows us to grow up. And we all need experience. But unfortunately, the experience of many children these days is rather terrifying. And this is where we come to this ecological debt, that what children foresee, be it real or not, in a sense, it doesn't really matter. Fear is what's experienced rather than. So children are terrified. A study came out last year, it was done between May and June of 2021. It's the largest study done in terms of the so-called eco-anxiety. Eco-anxiety is a term that is psychologists use these days to describe what people feel in the face of what looks like ecological crisis, environmental crisis. It's not perhaps the best term because anxiety tends to imply that it's an irrational reaction. Now, everyone who's got a bit of a sense of what's going on in the world knows this is completely rational to be very afraid. And in fact, so calling it anxiety seems to pathologize it, whereas the pathology is really being indifferent to it. It's really kind of saying, oh, it'll take care of itself. A better word is some people use ecological distress, because that seems to indicate that something real is going on here and we have to pay attention. So anyway, so 10,000 people, young people between ages 16 and 25 from 10 different countries, including the Philippines, Nigeria, India, Portugal, Brazil, Australia, UK, France, Finland, US, were asked certain questions. 60% of these people said they're very or extremely worried about climate change. 60% are very or extremely worried. 45% said feelings about climate change negatively affect their daily lives. So 45% of people between that age feel that daily fears of climate change is affecting their life. So nearly half saying this has daily impact on how I live. And there's this whole sense that they're talking about what's in ethics called moral injury, that young people are looking at their leaders, people in politics, us, and saying, you're not doing anything. And I don't understand what's going on. My whole future is being compromised. And I don't see any action being taken, or very little action. And how can we just stand there if I walk out of the street and I see someone pummeling someone else, I'll call the police and the police will do something. We're pummeling a whole generation and multiple generations down the road, and you can't call the police. No one's there to save them. So there's this sense of this moral injury at the face, looking at injustice and how this is going to look. I mean, again, UN are saying that pretty much within 2040, by 2040, there will be 700 million climate refugees in the world. 700 million people will be out of their homes because of flooding, because of drought, because of war induced by these climate disasters. So children, the experience that they have is very, very difficult, and it doesn't allow them to grow up in a way that would keep them with the ecological virtues and not allow them to grow out of the ecological vices, you could say. Now, so how do we provide people with experience that's going to allow them to grow, feel settled, be grounded, and out of that, act? Because what's tremendous and terrible about ecological anxiety or distress is that it can be very paralyzing. It can shut people down. It can make them despairing. And when Jesus says, I've come to bring you life and life to the full, despair has no part of that, because hope and despair cannot coexist, it seems. Hope and fear can coexist, maybe, but despair is the worst of all situations, because it's the utter lack of hope. Anxiety. The eating of flesh by parasites, by paradise, by parachutes not packed right. The failure of breaks, of fates, of lakes, of being born too late. The conflicted death of wealth, of health, of attachments to a grounded self. Going, gone. coming, coming soon, every dream a choking nightmare in this burning locked bedroom. To our children, to our youth, to our nervous systems, to our IQs, what on earth, poor earth, does it all do? I'm so scared I want to die, stick a threaded needle in my eye that makes me blind and makes me cry and saves me from the ugly question why. So there's a very real, and I think this is where we entered the spiritual realm. This is where I feel most comfortable. I'm a spiritual director, so people come to me and talk about their experience with God. And of course, that encompasses everything. The sense that God is not up there, but it is integral to our lives. Desolation, says Ignatius, moves one toward lack of faith and leaves one without hope and without love. One is completely listless, tepid, and unhappy and feels separated from our Creator and Lord. I think we've entered into a cultural and perhaps even generational desolation, where many people feel totally separated because of the experience that they've had. And this feeling separate from the Creator, partly because we're separated from creation, and the sense of a loving God, a God that has personal interest in each one of us. And desolation shuts us down, basically. The desolation is kind of a technical word that Ignatius uses as opposed to consolation. Consolation is whatever brings hope, love, and faith. In the case of persons who are earnestly purging away their sins and who are progressing in the service of God, it is characteristic of the evil spirit to cause gnawing anxiety, to sadden, and to set up obstacles. In this way, he unsettles these persons by false reasons aimed at preventing their progress. So Ignatius saw what he calls the enemy of our human nature is we're by nature good, and the enemy wants us to live as opposed to our inherent goodness. And I think it's working again culturally and generationally with this ecological anxiety, that the evil spirit is working overtime to keep us very afraid, ever more divided, and false reasoning in a sense. Ignatius, sometimes it helps to kind of personify the evil one, but you would say that the evil one becomes most subtle when he uses partly true reasons, and so that we can go with it and then twist it. So again, the ecological crisis is very real, and we should be very concerned. But when it becomes a gnawing anxiety that shuts us down and does not allow us a full life, that's the evil one trying to win us over, in a sense. So, but with persons of this type, someone who's going towards God, someone who has goodness in their hearts, is characteristic of the good spirit to stir up courage and strength, consolations, tears, inspirations, and tranquility. The good spirit makes things easier to live and eliminates obstacles so that the person may move forward in doing good. And I think all these activists who are putting their life sometimes on the line, many of the younger generation saying this has got to change and are courageously saying so and boldly doing things in the name of that, are actually very much inspired by the good spirit. Even if they're stirring the pot, they're very much inspired by the good spirit. And they're moving forward and doing good. And needs to be encouraged. So I guess I'll leave it with that, but for us, I mean, we need, because we live out of experience and God meets us in our experience, we have to find ways of allowing, I think, not only young people, but all people not to be paralyzed by fear, and yet not to slip into this desolation that says everything's going to take care of itself, or it doesn't matter. It's so far gone, and people are starting to think this, it's so far gone that no matter what I do, it's hopeless. And that's the evil one that wants to rob us of the fullness of life. That's the one that's saying to the children, do not let them come to me. So we have to do this, however, and John is going to hopefully show us a little bit what Jesus meant in all this. Thank you, John.
Thanks. So Benny, you can put up my PowerPoint. Thank you so much, Greg. You sort of mentioned this. There's one thing in common that we all have who are not children. And that's that we were once children. It's one of the things that we as adults share. There's a lot of things we might not share, but we were all once children. And what's most fascinating, I think, about Jesus' teaching on children is that he teaches about children. When you think about the fact that Jesus teaches that children are our models, it's really sort of odd. Like, in what way are they, especially 20 centuries ago? Were children valued as models? They were certainly loved. Got it working. Okay. So the fact that Jesus holds children up as models for us is really important to think about. What is Jesus teaching about children exactly? So I want to look at that quickly. What did Jesus mean by it, that we should model ourselves after children? How do we do that? How are children to be welcomed? And also, how were children generally treated at the time of Jesus? And for our purposes tonight, in conversation with Greg, how does it help us understand our current ecological crises, and how can children teach us? I'm going to see if this will work this time. Nope. There we go. So I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. Greg brought up one of these verses from Matthew, but the reason I'm bringing them up, and I'll just read a short portion of each one, is that they appear in all of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So we know that this is teaching that goes back to Jesus and that it's significant for him. Think about who else Jesus might hold up as models for us. Children are at the heart of it. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me. Let's read this verse from Matthew. Whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And we had that verse, Greg read that for us as well. From the Gospel of Luke. An argument arose among them as to which of them was the greatest. But Jesus, aware of their inner thoughts, took a little child and put it by his side and said to them, whoever welcomes this child in my name welcomes me. That's all three of the synoptic gospels. For biblical scholars, this means high probability we're dealing with the actual teaching of Jesus, right? And so children are at the heart of his teaching. And so you can take those teachings and you can get this basic order that we see here. If you welcome a child in my name, you welcome me. Whoever causes one of these little ones to sin, it would be better to be thrown into the sea with a millstone. And this is exactly why the poor treatment of children, or the abuse or worse of children, is so painful, both when we think about it in the past and as we deal with it today. See that you do not despise one of these little ones, for their angels always behold the face of my Father. Whoever gives a cup of water to one of these little ones, he will not lose his reward. So this language of little ones in Greek is mikroi or mikros, and that probably comes from Hebrew katan, which means a small one or a little one. So little ones, I think, probably originally applied to children. And I'll talk later about how it can be applied to all of Jesus' disciples and how this might be language that would be worth us bringing back and applying to ourselves as well. Jesus also talks about receiving the kingdom of God like a child. And this is where, as Greg was talking about, the disciples get indignant. And we might ask why they do. Well, what if you're an apostle of the Messiah? What if you're like 12 guys who were chosen by the Messiah to be with him? This looks pretty good on a resume. Looks pretty good when you think about what's my role going to be in the coming kingdom of God. I'm a pretty big deal. Why would you want a child to impinge on your greatness. Whoever does not receive the kingdom as a little child will never enter it. Let the little children come to me and do not stop them, for it is to such as these that the kingdom of God belongs. And once again, all of these teachings appear in all of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Truly, I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. So we're talking about infants here. When you look at the Greek, it's using language like brephe, infants, not just little children in some cases. And these are people who Jesus is holding up as models as well. So he lays hands on them. It's probably not at this point some sort of formal or sacramental laying on of hands, but the joy of a great one, a great teacher, reaching out and taking notice of someone little or small. So again, we can sort of reconstruct this teaching of Jesus when we look at all of these gospels. They were bringing children to Jesus, but the disciples rebuked them. Jesus says, let the children come. And not only that, but you have to receive the kingdom of God like a child. He laid his hands on the children and blessed them. So Jesus holds the children up here as being worthy of welcome by him. Indeed, the kingdom belongs to children such as these. Indeed, we have to receive the kingdom like a child. So it seems worth asking, how do you do that? I would like to do that. I'd like to know how that works. Now, before answering that question, I would like to talk a little bit about what life was like for children at the time of Jesus in Judea, in Rome, in Greece. I won't get that specific, but just general comments. So how did children live at the time of Jesus? These are, so it's not a great photo. I took it at a museum in Corinth. These are little children's toys, just like toys today in some ways, but they're made out of plaster or clay. And so it's a little doll in a little cradle or a crib. Well, one of the things that impacted children in antiquity was high rates of infant mortality, high rates of maternal mortality. Lots and lots of women died in childbirth. Lots of children died, of course, before they reached a year old. I won't venture percentages, but people do talk about how many it might have been. We know that someone like the great Cicero, 6 children were born to him and his wife, and 2 survived infancy. That seems fairly common. There's a woman who died at the age of 27, her inscriptions in Rome, who gave birth to 7 children, and 1 lived beyond infancy, because it's on her inscription. She, of course, died at 27. So we're starting to have children we can reconstruct from the inscription at about the age of 12 or 13. So children also moved out of childhood into adulthood probably fairly quickly compared to our own day. In some cases, not amongst the Jews, but amongst the Romans and the Greeks, some children were exposed. That is, they were set aside. They were not accepted into the family. And they were not necessarily killed, but they were put in places like town dumps where people would pick them up. Some of them were raised in that very family. Some of them were enslaved. Babies were often nursed at this time by enslaved women who would serve as wet nurses, or women would be hired to do that as well. So this was a part of the very beginning of life for children. Now, Mark Golden, the late Mark Golden, a great Canadian classicist who actually did his master's degree here at UBC and then taught for years and years at University of Winnipeg, wrote an article years ago called "Did the Ancients Care When Their Children Died?" Because they did die so often. And Mark concludes in a terrific article, yeah, they did. I mean, it was hard to connect, right, when you were losing children at such a young age, but the loss was felt. Because even to a greater degree than we today, people depended on their children to take care of them. economically, and to care for them in terms of, well, their social lives after a certain point, right? And their physical lives as well. So to be a child in antiquity really depended on your social class. And we might say that's much the same today, right? That it depends what kind of family you're born into. But there are a lot of children in antiquity who were enslaved. A lot of children in antiquity were poor. And only some, of course, would come from a wealthy family where they would be able to be educated and have some leisure. In terms of the lives of boys and girls, they were pretty distinct in antiquity. Now, boys and girls were raised by mothers for the most part until the age of 7. After that, their social roles were quite distinct in the ancient world. Girls tended to stay at home until they married, and marriage could happen at a fairly young age. So post-puberty, girls could get married, and that was the case in the Jewish context, the Greek context, Roman context. And there's lots of evidence of that. In terms of education, if we're talking about formal education, of learning how to read and write, of actually going to school, a small percentage of boys. So not many of them would have been educated in the way that we think about education today. Now, more Jews learned to read and write because of the focus on the Torah and learning the Torah and learning God's word. And this education would probably end for children that were lucky enough to have it at about the age of 16. Children and work. When you hear the stories in the Gospels about shepherds taking care of their sheep, think children. That's who's probably out with those sheep at night. Very good work by a scholar, Amy Lindemann Allen, who has really demonstrated that it's boys in particular, but there could be girls too, who are out at night taking care of the sheep. For most girls, their work would be in the home, did a lot of weaving, a lot of work on the loom. Boys would work in the home, in fields. And for most people, work was agricultural, right? 90% probably of work was agricultural back then. This work could start at a young age, 5 or 6 years old. Certainly if they were enslaved children, it could start at that age. But if you're in a poor family, this was not a matter of exploitation. This was a matter of when you need to eat, everyone needs to help. Everyone needs to be out there in the world. Did they ever play? They did. And there's lots of evidence of that, of toys as well, of dolls that girls had, of board games that children played. And they also had pets such as rabbits, mice, geese, and dogs. And so in speaking of the field mouse, they made little sort of chariots or carts in ancient Rome, and they would attach mice to them. And they would pull those. And this was a clear toy that children played with. There were sports as well. Again, this would take place in a gymnasium. We've kept that name, but not exactly the institution, the ancient institution. But boys did play games as well, and it was really set aside for boys. So what is it then that leads Jesus to proclaim children as model disciples? They lived, ordinary lives for the most part. They had to work at a younger age. They married at a younger age if they were girls, but also for boys too. Lots of evidence in Jewish literature that boys would marry at around 16 to 18. It was older for Romans, and Greeks would marry somewhere in between. And this is just sort of basic data, right? There are particulars that would change from every culture. But children in the ancient world were generally loved and cared for, just as children today, but they weren't exactly seen as models for adults. In fact, the opposite, they were seen as unformed adults. They needed to get big before you could take them seriously. And Greg spoke about some of the vices children can have. Children can be very selfish and possessive, cruel and destructive. Despite their vivid imaginations, as Greg says, they can have difficulty foreseeing the consequences of their actions, which can harm others, but also themselves, for those of us who remember being children, and some of the things we did and luckily escaped from. So these vices illumine what Jesus was not talking about when he describes children as model disciples. They're not simply innocent or perfect. And if you teach undergraduates and you teach this material and they haven't had a lot of contact with children, they often go to innocence as a description of what it means to be like children. And I think back to when you were a child and spend some time with children. Perhaps if I didn't have so much experience with children, Debbie Thomas writes, I'd be tempted to sentimentalize the connection. I've heard well-meaning people suggest, for example, that Jesus likens children to God because children are so purely good or unselfish or accepting or meek. Well, I don't know a lot of children like that. The ones I know are far more interesting. They're feisty, clever, quick, fierce, generous, selfish, naughty, obedient, curious, bored, quiet, loud, challenging, funny, surprising, solemn, and exhausting. I think Jesus knew as much when he described children as worthy representations of God. So that does ask, what does Jesus think children can teach us? So Greg used a number of words. I have a bunch of words too. I'm going to read some of them. I'm only going to be able to look at one or two of them, but I ask you to think about what works for you when you think about what Jesus thinks children can teach us. How about wonder? Oh, you used that one. Wonder's a good one. Imagination. And I think close to that for me is enchantment. When I think about myself as a child, I think of the world as alive. Sort of literally, and maybe that's where stuffed animals come into play at a certain age, but everything seemed to be alive. I also think there's something about children's presence and focus on what is. They can be so attentive to what's going on around them in a way that we can walk through the world and ignore just about everything. And children are so focused and so present. And I think this is something to teach us about ecology. I think they're also focused on location, especially when you think about little children, they can't go very far, right? When they go somewhere, they're taken there by parents. And so they're focused on where they are, the presence, their location. So I grew up in South Vancouver. This was a time when there was a lot of corner stores. So we lived at East 38th and Windsor, and there was a store right on the corner that our neighbors in Newman's owned. I could go there. And there was second store, that's what we called it. That was a block away. You could go there, but it was getting a little dicey to walk that far. And then there was third store. And to go to third store, you were sort of taking a chance. It was out of your little neighborhood. But we did go to third store one summer because they had Green Avenger water pistols. I don't know if any of you know these Green Avenger water pistols. They fit right in your hand so you could hide them and you could shoot people with water and they wouldn't see it. Wouldn't see it coming. So what does it mean? Because you're so located in a certain place and it's a pretty small place and that becomes your world. They're also vulnerable. And it's this kind of vulnerability, of course, that is hard to be as an adult. In fact, what we don't want to be is vulnerable. We want to be tough. We don't want to be hurt. And of course, there's dependence. Children depend on people to take care of them. They need us as adults to care for them. So children teach us to honor our imaginations as pathways to God. They teach us to risk hard questions on our way to God. They teach us to trust in God's abundance, and they teach us what divine power actually looks like. So I couldn't get the video to play. I'm technologically not astute, but I want to point out this, oh, could I play it? Is it possible? What are they cheering? A man digging a hole and throwing a dirt. That's got to be wonder, right? An enchantment. And being rooted in your place. That man's digging a hole and he's throwing dirt. What a good life. So the traits, Jesus teaching asks us to move beyond a simple welcome of children to learn from children. So the traits of children, attentiveness, vulnerability, openness, dependence, trust, connectedness to the world around them is relevant for how we care for the earth and how we care for the environment as a whole. If our treatment of the earth, as Pope Francis says, is rooted in a spiritual crisis, maybe children can teach us how to get small and care for what matters most. Children teach us what divine power looks like. If we transfer these ways of looking at the environment through children's eyes, then we begin to see the way God wants us to treat children, and by extension, God's creation. A young child is a very picture of helpless dependence, of powerless, of need. What can we learn from Jesus' teaching on children with respect to ecological concerns of children today? I think they can root us in a more dependent and compassionate relationship to the world around us, acknowledging, of course, as Greg has said, and I repeated, they're not perfect. They're not always innocent. But strangely, to see the world as children see it is to become spiritually mature, to center others rather than ourselves, to care for the future and not just our present, to think about the needs of all and not just what we want. So I have this question. Are we actually listening to children today? Are we learning from them as Jesus taught us to do? Children have to be raised and cared for. Those of us who have raised children know it's not easy. And they need guidance and they need support and need all kinds of things, including discipline. But they have to be brought to maturity. But there's something about their focus on the present, upon the world around them, of care of their people, for their people and places, that must always be encouraged. We have to be aware that our own focus on getting bigger might make us miss the littleness that allows us to pay attention to the needs of children and of the earth. I want to ask this question as well, coming towards the end here. Is life for children actually better today than it was 2,000 years ago? I ask you to think about that. It's an important question without a simple answer, I think. In some ways, such as legal protections of children, lifespan, infant mortality, all kinds of measures, I think we can genuinely say life is much better. Way more children grow up and become adults. Yet in other ways, children are sometimes treated not as whole people today, but their days are programmed. And I don't want this to be simply an old guy reminiscing about when you could run the streets, right? And go to one store, a second store, a third store. But I do think we're not allowing their wonder its full range. Yes, they are treated as precious objects. But I also see the control of children as maybe having a parallel to how we treat the environment and nature today. That we control, shape it, and use it without close attention to what it needs or requires. We often just keep asking the question, what do I want? That is, what do I want from the environment? Without thinking, how should I treat it? In some ways, I would argue we're perpetuating the apostles' desire to send the children away from Jesus. At an individual or familial level, we seem to treat children with greater affection and more respect than ancient people. But at a social and ecological level, we're not listening to them or caring for them. So the model here too is Jesus himself and his radical choice to be dependent upon others. So Jesus himself is both the model of the earthly child and the model child for Christians as a son of God. To be like a child, one does have to focus on maturity as well, but we also have to mature away from the things that seem to give us strength or power. We can't be condescending and treat the earth as we treat children. So we should think about, how do we really want to treat children? Not to condescend, not to take control, not to know better, but as we help them mature, that we care for the whole person and for the whole environment. All of Jesus' disciples are ultimately little children. So just want to read a couple more Bible passages. In the Gospel of John 13:33, Jesus referred to his apostles and disciples as little children. In that Greek language, teknia points to little children. And later in the same Gospel of John 21:5, he talks about them as paideia, little children. So the disciples are also amongst the children. The specification of all as children of God reveals something not only about humanity and the followers of Jesus, but about the nature of God. Actual children, Jesus taught, are the model disciples, and they must be welcomed as Jesus himself. They show us how to enter the kingdom of God. Children remind us that we're all children of God, whose goal ultimately is not power, wealth, prestige, but life in the kingdom of God, modeled after Jesus' own relationship with God. We are called into a relationship, into a family where, as we're told in Paul's letters, we've been adopted into the family. And as members of this family, we're called to live as children, growing to maturity, but always remaining the only thing that matters, beloved children. When this occurs, when we see ourselves as children still, we'll care for children and see the world as children see it, something to cherish and to care for. We'll become most ourselves, most magnanimous when we learn the littleness of the child. Thank you. So we have time for questions. So Greg, do you want to join me up here? And I don't know how many questions we have, Betty, that have come in. You can stop screen sharing if you want. Yeah, you could take it away. Or you're saying it's not here? Okay. Any questions? I know that there's a couple for Greg that have come online, so if you want me, I can go read those. If we want to start there as people think about their questions here. So, Greg, a question came in for you. How can we relearn how to help children and youth in the difficult and important transition from childhood to adulthood, accepting the responsibilities of adulthood without losing the wonder, imagination, and non-discrimination?
If we could answer that, we'd all be happier, I think. I really do think it's practice. I'm starting to realize this. I mean, we have to daily, I think, practice maintaining wonder and being open to that. And I think each one of us does it differently, but to actually think that this is important. I have to maintain wonder. I have to daily practice my capacity for awe and gratitude. And hopefully that will allow me I think gratitude is so essential and allow me to grow in responsibility, because if I feel grateful for something, I want to protect it and keep it viable. So, I mean, it really is the great challenge of being human. How do we can't obviously go back. I mean, we both said that we just can't return to an innocence that wasn't really there. And yet we do have to, as Jesus said, if we don't change and become like humble and grateful and fun, ultimately fun, we don't really have the fullness of life. But I do think that this is the human condition. This is our task, our life task.
Well, let me ask the second question then. You described, she's speaking to you, Greg, the reign of God is a place where everyone's equal. I'd like to put this concept into dialogue with the First Nations understanding of all parts of creation are equally imbued with the spirit of the Creator. The human is not above the animals, plants, and other elements of creation. In the Book of Wisdom, we hear that God's imperishable spirit is in all things. God created. And so just a comment or a reflection perhaps on that.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And I think, again, I do believe that if we can touch into our deepest selves, we all have an intuition of that we are all part of something so sacred and so precious and so one that we, again, that's kind of our task, is to stay there as often as we can, and to return there as often as we can, because that's where we feel most, I think we feel most fulfilled and most alive. Yeah, and I mean, the whole First Nations and Indigenous peoples knowing that we're all kin, and we're all there's salmon people, there are tree people, we're all kin, and I think that again that fulfills us when we believe that. Yes.
Would you like to ask a question at the microphone? That way people at home can hear it as well. Well, you're coming, I'll ask the third question that's coming online, if that's okay. In our society, especially on the West Coast, we frequently hear of people being spiritual but not religious. I start with the assumption that this should not be disparaged but worked with. The wonder of children at the natural world probably speaks to this and is also experienced by many adults who say they are spiritual. How can we better work with that wonder? Church and services outside work well, but what more?
Great observation and question. Exactly. Instead of shutting people down and saying, oh, let's work with this hunger for spirituality rather than somehow diminish it. And I think a lot of people experienced this during COVID, that people walked outside, spent more time outside, and just, this is wonderful. This makes me feel really good. And actually, I enjoy this and I feel connected. So rather than say somehow this is neo-paganism, why don't we work with that and really, we're entering, I think, a new understanding of what it is to be earthlings. And I think that should be celebrated rather than feared. And again, the First Nations and Indigenous people are telling us there's a creator, and we've believed that since Genesis, that there is a creator, and we can fully embrace that. And again, I think it makes sense to us. Yeah. Did you have any comments you want to add to those? Your own responses to any of those, John?
Let me think about that.
Yeah,
let me think about that. I'll go back and read them again. I'll let you come up and ask your question. I sort of held you up for a little bit. I apologize for that.
Today, November 22nd, is the anniversary of the death of C.S. Lewis, Aldous Huxley, and John Kennedy.
Wow.
All the same day. So Brave New World, A Full Camelot, and Narnia. And so you've given part of an answer to my question, just being open, number one. So I find wonder in Narnia. There's all sorts of problems with the language, but I find it there. And also in Arosha, there's a farm, which is intergenerational. And welcome to people from any age and any background to experience that wonder and discover it again. So how can we, Greg, you're so good at so many of this, so this is where I trust the question. How do we elicit wonder from children? And how do we model wonder ourselves?
Yeah.
If that's a conscious thing, and I don't know whether it is.
Well,
thank you.
Yeah. Again, this is this great paradox between, I think we have to try, but we can't obviously try too hard, because as soon as we try too hard, the wonder dies. If we were actually to take it seriously as part of our spirituality, I mean, if liturgy was supposed to evoke wonder in us, if we thought that our spiritual selves were wondrous or wonderful, and that was when we came together to worship, that wonder was a deep part of worship. Maybe we, even just to think about that, we would start to say, okay, what do we need to do as a community to maintain wonder and to cultivate it? And be brave enough to say, okay, the things that we're doing that don't really do that perhaps need to change. And so as the comment came, maybe we need to spend more time outside as a community of faith, is it spend more time in creation, and we just might start to understand the Creator a little more. Yeah, would you mind just saying a little bit more about Arosha? Just for people that, because it's very, very important, I think. And again, we're working on a lot of this. Maybe could you just set this mic so people online can hear?
Peter Miranda Harris, were Anglican clergy from England, started a mission in Portugal. And they began it because no one was interested in their mission by counting birds. And eventually people were attracted to their love of creation. And in over 20 countries, there are sites which are Christian groups committed to creation care and the teaching of that. They manifest in many different ways. There's some really good literature that come out of the place. And much of it came out of Lauren Wilkinson, a friend of yours, and Regent College. They've taught there a fair amount. But the local expression of that is in Surrey. What's the name of the farm here? I can't remember. It's just look up Arosha, you'll find the name of the farm. There's also one in Hamilton. There's also one in Winnipeg. And they're educational institutions, but they're very worshipful and wait on God to grant wonder. Abraham Joshua Heschel said, I asked for wonder and you gave it to me. So asking is the beginning of that. And Arosha is very helpful in that. And they're very inclusive in terms of spiritual traditions. Each particular site has a particular spiritual inclination. But it's a remarkable place. Margaret Atwood spoke at one of their gatherings, and so did Catherine Hayhoe. There's a real catalyst, and the Suzuki Foundation chair their board has been fascinating. He came to one of the gatherings. I happened to be involved with it, and he said, there's 200 people in this room. They're people of faith, and there's something wrong with the fact I don't know them. And so it was quite lovely as that unfolds, that story of gathering together. So that's a start. Sorry, that's a little convoluted.
No, but thank you. Yeah, very important. So again, look it up. And again, Arosha is very based in science. These are biologists working, and science, they do in such a way that it cultivates wonder. It promotes wonder.
Arosha means rock in Portuguese.
Yes.
And the site in Surrey has actually discovered species that have been missing in the ecological change. They look after the Campbell River watershed that have been missing for 40 years.
Wow.
It happens to be called the Squamish sucker, so it's not a particularly fabulous name, but they are based in science. I think that's an important thing to mention.
It is. Thank you.
What's the spelling of this so I can put it in the
Arosha
chat?
is A-R-O-C-H-A. Yeah, 2 words. Yeah, A space
Okay,
R-O-C-H-A.
thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Great, thanks very much for your talk. Really wonderfully provocative in the best way. I wonder if you could just share with us, you mentioned in the context of the experience of desolation in the Ignatian context, the presence or the agency of an evil spirit. And I'm interested in picking up on how do you think that would work in a context where so many identify as spiritual but not religious? This may not be good news for those folks, but I'm thinking there's something here that we can bring that's important.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I think that's the power of Ignatian spirituality, that it can. Ignatius came to it by just long, hard self-observation. And so he saw that, kind of as Paul says, I do things that I don't like to do, and the things I want to do, I don't do. Why is that? And I think that has a lot to do with ecology too, and even getting outside. I mean, how much of us know that if I just went for a walk, I'd feel much better, and yet we continue at the computer not going for walks. Again, I find it, some people don't find it helpful to personify evil, and that could go off the rails, I think. But this whole notion that there is part of me that doesn't react the way, it doesn't operate the way I want it to operate. There's a liberation in that too, I think. And I think that's what Paul was getting at, and it's certainly what Ignatius is getting at. That things, when I can start to see desolation at work in me, and that I'm under kind of an occupying force, you could say, I can forgive myself in a way. I can liberate myself from feelings of shame or inadequacy. And that, in fact, is really a liberation. And Ignatius certainly felt it, and I do too, that I mean, good spirituality ought to liberate us. It ought to free us and to allow us to make good decisions and live life, not being torn kind of hither and yon by our attachments, or disordered attachments, as he would say. So all these things work on a very personal, like a very human level, I think. And you certainly don't need to be religious in a sense to get the goodness of this. And I think that's why so many people find themselves described in a sense by Ignatius. So I don't know if that at all answers anything, but again, you certainly don't want to spiritualize things, because that can be dangerous. And yet, in my own experience and directing other people and theirs, there is something liberating about that. Because again, shame and fear are what bind us, what keep us back. And if we can go through, if we can see how there's this inexplicable tendency in all of us towards shame and fear, and we can start to see how that operates in the patterns that each one uniquely have, then we can somehow start to live differently. And yes.
Yeah, it might be.
Yeah, it is.
through here.
Pitfalls and.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the talk. I was thinking about with the emergency of our climate crisis, we sort of have to be like parents coming into this, where the First Nations talk about 7 generations and caring for the 7th generation from now. And it's interesting to think about being more like a child, because I do think that we have to take responsibility and we have to start taking action. And I hear a lot of people talking about a sense of, well, I can't do anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
Or so the desolation you talk about, oh, the price is too great, it's too expensive, or whatever reason. So I really enjoyed when you talk about children being shepherds. I suppose draws 2 together, the children looking after the sheep, much like a parent would look after a child. So I just curious your thoughts on that. And this, in my mind, there's a sense of urgency that we've got to get on with it. We've got to be like parents, look after our kids, because our children will be the ones in 2050 and 2080 and beyond that will be suffering as a consequence of what we've done in the past.
Yes, exactly.
Curious your thoughts on that.
Thank you. John, do you want to?
Yeah, I hope I am. Thank you for that comment. Yeah, I think in our discussions as we talked about joining together to give this talk, one of the things that Greg pointed out, I think that was so important was, children need to be raised, right? They need guidance, they need support. But I do think we have to learn from each other. And I was trying to get at, the children have this responsibility to be children and to teach us in that way. And we have the responsibility to continue to look at them and to look what they really need, not simply what we want, and to let them be the people, the full people they should be in maturity. And I do think there is that kind of circularity to it, that the more you become a true adult, the more you become like a child again. And I know there is a sense in which, and the ancients talked about this too, there's a second childhood when you reach your ancient age yourself. You know what I mean? Where you realize again what's most important. And I think what we need to do, and that's where the concentration on wonder, I think, can allow us to maybe grasp that earlier, because you can get so caught up in your life in what do I need to achieve? What do I need to get? And I think when we do that socially and we do that internationally, you see what the impact on the environment. And so I think in order to guide children, we need to listen to them and I think, focus on what matters most. And that is the care for them and the care for creation. I mean, sometimes it all just comes back over and over to me. And maybe this is a kind of a childlikeness that, you boil down the Bible to love of God and love of neighbor. How can I best love God? How can I best love my neighbor? And when we center children in that, how can I best, love God and love my neighbor so that children have the best world possible at an environmental and at a spiritual level?
And the beautiful things, I mean, that we're all needed. That sometimes I don't like when the talk is like as if only the youth matter.
Yeah.
And the rest of us, we're cooked, we're done, we're only the problem. That's not true. Again, if we were to look at this in ecologically, every person, every individual in the ecosystem has a place and is important. So each one of us, and each generation, the grandparents, the parents, the children, we're all needed. And so that's where the exciting stuff happens, where we actually start to work together and see how do we learn from each other. And no one has all the goods. We have all the goods are only gotten by sharing. So yeah, absolutely, that we learn from each other and we be open. And I think that's what Jesus was getting at. Be open. You don't have all the answers. They don't have all the answers. We're building the kingdom of heaven as a community.
Any final questions? Yeah. 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 Well, I think it's an excellent insight. I think that's a really good point for those who might not have heard it, though, who are watching online. The comment was, how do we restore awe, that sense of awe that children just naturally have when they see that dirt being thrown? When I came across that video, I just smiled and smiled, and because it's so genuine and true. And I know it can be hard, but I do think it is a kind of a spiritual practice. And I think it's something, so for me, it's being with my dog, because the dog is so present and you have to be present. The dog's world is this trail, whatever it's sniffing off in the woods, and it brings you there, right? And it brings you into the reality of that forest. It's not, and so that sort of can restore my sense of wonder about the place I'm in, and that kind of attentiveness to place that children give as well. That's a wonderful comment. Thank you.
I might just say that be shameless. I mean, I think shame, as I was saying, shame is our worst enemy, and have fun shamelessly. To be shameless in our wonder, because we sometimes think we have to hold ourselves back. We have to look. We have to uphold decorum or all the convention or whatever. Hell with it. So, pardon my French, but in a certain degree, that we have to. Yeah, we can't be confined, I think, in certain ways.
reading something in the tablets just recently. Magazine.
Yeah.
And they were saying that how to bring a sense of awe to children and to young people. And so, as mentioned, they would take them outside. And really, the classroom was outdoors. And they called it the church without walls.
Yes, yeah,
I thought that was a great
yeah,
term.
exactly. There's a whole movement called Forest Church. Yes,
Church without walls.
yeah, it's wonderful. Yeah, and I think that's just going to grow. It's just going to grow.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. Let's encourage it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I mean, one of the hopes of the center here is to ask questions about why have people disengaged from the religious tradition. We need to listen to people on that score, I think, and to pay attention to what they're saying. This is one way we can be attentive. And I think, with respect to the question about spiritual or religious, let's meet people where they are. And what is giving people wonder, and what is giving them joy, what is giving them pleasure, and maybe not discount that, but find out what we can learn from it. Amen. I'll give you an amen too. We don't do amens that well in the Catholic Church, not in the, certain church traditions have a more rousing amen, but amen. For those who are here in person, please join us for refreshments. In Plato's Cave, we have light refreshments. I don't want to over promise, but we do have refreshments. Be filled with a sense of wonder when you have them, though. Thank you for coming, both in person and online. And if people were not able to be here tonight that you're aware of or know that might enjoy this, this will appear on our YouTube channel, on the St. Mark's College YouTube channel. So send them there. And if you're at all interested in these sorts of discussions, you can go to our podcast, What Matters Most, available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever fine podcasts are found. And that is an emerging work of the center, and we want that to continue. So please feel free, if you listen to podcasts, track it down and listen. Thank you so much for coming. I also want to thank, before we leave, Greg Kennedy for coming here and for offering us this. Really thankful. Thank you.